Dave Monk, you're at Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And today is Sunday, September the 2nd. Yep, we've clicked over to another month here. And this is the Prairie Monk Show, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, conservation, ecology, and whatever Dave has been thinking about this week.
Well, yes, last night there was a music festival on Walnut Street. It's quite huge, very respectful, and people were interacting with each other. Little kids were dancing, adults were dancing. The bar trade was doing very well, including the newly opened pork bar across the road from us. The music was Kayla Brown, followed by Craig Russo, Cuban-style jazz, and I found that to be rather interesting. And then Mojo, and I'm not quite sure the full title of Mojo.
I think that was a band that did covers of Tom Petty, who passed away last year, or earlier this year.
And it was a memorial to him. So I had several contacts last week. We had Kurt Tucker was still in town, and he came along with Calvin, his son. We visited the new location of the Pocket Prairie on 2nd Street. And Liz Rudnick was here to deliver her son as a freshman to computer science and robotery, and we got talking. She shouted me to a coffee at Cape of Cafe Kobe, which is an interesting institution in itself. It allows people to integrate and talk to each other. WEFT often goes around there. The coffee that we had whipped cream on top. Oh. That reminded me of growing up with cows and milk that we separated and then converted to butter, and that took me back to Australia. Later, I followed through with last week's historic discussion on the cattle bank and local history and the 200th anniversary of the Illinois inauguration with distribution of cheesecake and lots of interesting conversation. I met up with a teacher who had been 30 years at the high school that is an experimental school associated with the curriculum map. And we talked, and she also lives in Lake Park, where we need to do things with the Lake Park 2.5 acres of prairie, because if we don't, it will revert to weeds. And so that was good contact. She invited me to speak at a monthly or a periodic historic speech, and she wanted to ask me how I got into this act of preserving prairie. And that's not what I usually do. I'm much more happy to be discussing the preservation of prairie than to be discussing the role that I might have played in doing that sort of work. But I also realize that biographies often stimulate activity in future generations. So I have to think about doing that. So one of what am I about to say? Some of you know some of my background in the east coast of Australia. But in looking at my Australian records, I came across a book about John Flynn. And I thought it would be interesting for you to know about John Flynn. John Flynn was born in Victoria to a country situation. His aunt brought him up because his mother died in childbirth. And he gradually migrated to the Presbyterian ministry, became a minister, and one of his focuses was on the independent people who had pioneered the centre of Australia. You have to know that the very centre of Australia is a desert, and the arable land is around the coast and to the east. The pioneers that go out into the hinterland are often on their own and not awfully safe. So Flynn decided to do something about that. He set up centers where pedal ready to get the electricity to run your radio. You had to have a bicycle type piece of equipment where you pedaled to create that airwave, and so there was some communication with people who were out in the boondocks. And my family has had quite a bit to do with this. My mother, born in England, migrated to Australia with the family. Grandfather was a tailor of note, and they settled in a suburb of Sydney. My mother became an artist and also a seamstress and part tailor. At one stage, she went off to be a governess with a ranch, or in Australian terms called a station, a sheep and cattle station, perhaps some arable working for wheat, but not a lot. And when you are in a remote area like that, you are dependent on radio broadcasts. The children, 3 children, my mother as a governess was there to help with their education. And the education was often through a radio broadcast to a Blackfriars school in Sydney that distributed information. Excuse me. And there was correspondence that went with that. And so it was helpful to have someone who would work with the family to do that schooling and to look after the children. The station would usually have workers, and those workers became part of the family also. Even the horses and the cattle often were friendly pets. Not so much the cattle, but the horses, you got to know their personality and how long you had to open a gate and close a gate before the horse took off, understanding that you knew what you were doing, but you might not have known what you were doing. So you could be left on the ground by a knowledgeable horse who was taking off and doing his job. The shearers would come to shear the sheep, and that was another crew of people that were part of the family for a short period. They had to be fed, so you had big kitchens. and they had to be housed, and some of them were also historians and wrote poetry. So this was a family affair. The shearers would migrate north and south according to the climate and the ability to meet with the constraints of certain shearing sheds. The wool was put into huge bales that went to auction. Australia lived on the sheep's back for quite some time until plastics arrived. And plastics sort of took over because wool is a native fiber, and it's subject to all sorts of moths and creatures that can get into it, and plastics don't have that problem. So that's no longer the case, although there is lots of wool on the slopes. Let me tell you that you have a coastal plain with the plate tectonics, with the geology is that the Gondwana land, which sort of had a connection through to Asia via places like Singapore and India, and so early Aboriginals came down that corridor and settled in Australia many thousands of years ago, and they were very well adapted to a rather stringent climate. Australia was not very well developed when England lost control of the Americas and could no longer send convicts here. The convicts sort of had faced the fact that the dukes and earls decided they wanted estates, and so took over peasant-type agriculture. And the peasants went to industrial centres like Manchester and Liverpool and London, and weren't well housed, weren't well fed, and got into difficulties trying to survive. So lucky ones were not eliminated by lynching or by fire or other ways, but they were exported to the colonies, and so Australia was basically brought up with the administrators of convicts and convicts themselves. And they tended to take over Aboriginal territories. So that was on the coast. That was early settlement of Port Jackson and Sydney. And gradually it tried to move up and over that coastal escarpment, which is probably about 60 miles inland from the Pacific Ocean. It was not easy to run up the creeks and valleys and get onto the top of this plateau. And it was not easy to climb up the mountain and get onto the plateau that way. So it was a long while before Australia's settlers moved west. But you have to understand that rather low mountain sloped back to the desert and hinterlands to the west. The agriculture was mainly on sedimentary soils. That these sedimentary rocks were formed under the ocean, different periods of settlement, shales, clays, limestones, and not so much volcanic material. So Australian soils are pretty miserable. They grow eucalyptus forest fairly well, and so there's a lot of native species that survive on that soil, but it's not your rich soil like you get in east central Illinois. Every once in a while, the tectonics mean that you get a volcano and you get some rich granite and basaltic soils, and they grow tropical rainforests. They're called edaphic rainforests because they're dependent on the soil. So you can be driving from western part of Australia up the slopes to the height of the Great Divide, and there will be a few acres of very healthy tropical rainforest. That sort of rainforest was harvested fairly heavily for lumber, and still is. My people grew up on the coastal side of that, and prior to being on the coast, my father, who was born in Australia, probably was not a convict, but we don't know, had a name of Monk, which was, apparently has some base in Scandinavia. So there may have been some invasion of England and then eventual movement to Australia. This was in the era when people were colonizing, and so populations from the British Isles were encouraged to be out there in the boondocks, whether that was South Africa or New Zealand or wherever, Caribbean. The early explorers, Blackson, Wentworth, and Lawson, mainly, eventually got onto that plateau, and that plateau is basically sedimentary rock that's poured. How to get down the other side was another problem, and on the slopes to the west, there was still a little rainfall, and sheep and cattle could survive, and also some what we call cockying, or tilling of the soil for wheat and oats and like. Early on, horses were the main power source. Eventually, steam engines got over this mountain. They had a zigzag. That means you had like a Z, and you ran your train on one leg of the Z, and then you pushed it up to the next level, and you went back and forth until you got to the top of the escarpment. The same, it went in reverse going down on the slopes. Well, when you got to 10 inches of rainfall and you're going west from places like Lithgow and Orange and Parks and Forbes, you were getting into desert, and there was a temptation for people to be out there in areas where there was less rainfall than was needed, and so that led to dust storms and the movement of soil right out into the Pacific Ocean and to New Zealand. I can remember growing up with blue sun, and you looked at it, it was the light was being reflected by dust in the air. So people who went out into the hinterlands were game. They were looking for mining and gold, and some of these objectives had their footprints in the U.S. where gold was being harvested. But there are other minerals too, like copper. So in this picture, John Flynn decided to get out there. These were people who were doing heavy work. They had women who were accompanying them. They had families. It was very easy to be kicked by a horse or to slip with an axe and chop a leg or something like that. And there were no resources. So Flynn started to put together centers. They may have just one nurse. They may have 3 nurses. But they had radio contact, and they started to use planes. At the suggestion of the 24-year-old who lost his life in World War I, they started to use biplanes and to move patients from a place of danger to a health center. They had small hospitals. My aunt was a nurse, and she and one of her friends became a nurse at Marble Bar on the northwest coast of Australia, facing the Indian Ocean, but inland, probably about 20 or 30 miles. So I went to the internet to look up my aunt because I had a suspicion that she might be there. And indeed she is. She was regarded as a pioneer. And she was at first a nurse with 3 people. They had 30 miles away in Port Hedland with a doctor who was accessible. On one occasion, when they had a dangerous situation like a hernia or a appendix or something like that, the doctor, if not at Marble Bar, would talk the nurses through how to operate on the patient. If the doctor could get there, he would. And in one case where there was no plane, the plane was out somewhere else, there was no train, so the doctor hopped on a pumper truck. It's a little wagon which workmen use to roll along the rails to maintain them. So he pushed himself 30 miles to Marble Bar to get to the patient. And often it was a matter of walking the staff through things. And so there were maternity opportunities that were probably better held in a hospital. There were wards for males, wards for females, and wards for Aboriginals. One of the things that happened with Aboriginals is that they're in the desert and it's very cold at night, so often they would have a fire on one side and a fire on the other side, and be in a situation where sometimes in their sleep they would roll into a fire. So they would be have to be dealt with for burns. Often the small Aboriginal community with its social customs would control their members with a spiritualistic, not song and dance, although that corroboree was involved, but if a bone was metaphysically pointed at a wrongdoer, And no matter what happened to that person in hospital, he would invariably die. So the Aboriginals were dealt with differently. Gradually, this gentleman, John Flynn, became well known for dreaming. He not only dealt with radio and health centers, but he also was dealing with planes and people who could fly them, sometimes working with Qantas, which is the Australian National Airlines, and they would provide planes, and I think perhaps also pilots. But the pilots also had to be medically oriented, because they had to see what the situation is, apply ligatures, and stop bleeding, and get that patient onto a plane and to a center, or to have to actually be there listening to the directions from the nurses or the doctors concerned. So they had about 6 big circles in Australia that started this sort of dream. One of the starting places was a place called Cloncurry, and that was a prototype for other places. They also knew where the radio signals could be acquired with the use of overland landlines. There was one big landline that went right through Australia. Some were on the coast. And working with these constraints, they could get to people. You have to know that in the center of all this was a territory where there were no white people. It was about 6 times the size of Scotland, a huge area. Ayers Rock is in the middle of that. It's a tourist attraction at the moment, but there's also an Aboriginal site. If you were delivered mail, you had to cross dry lakes. Sometimes, if you had the occasional rain, that lake would become filled with water, so you had to have an ability to boat your mail across the lake to the other side, where you had another vehicle stored in a sand dune that would take the mail further. Often it wasn't a motorized vehicle. It was early work with Flynn. He was born in 1880 and died in 1950. So he was spread the area that also included a worldwide depression. But early visits were made with the aid of camels, and camel also became your pet. It's not easy to be a pet with a camel. The camel has its own mind. But this was how they worked. And with early cars, my father had one. It was a 1928 Whippet, which is kind of interesting because across the road from us to the left, we have a bar that's occupying what used to be a Willie's Night Whippet Jeep car sales place. And so my father was in his first appointment. Let's go back and say something about my father. He was a 14th child. This is in an era, a Victorian era, when children were your workforce. But as you got to World War II, you get to have fewer children because those children all survived. The health situations meant that the children survived, and they also had large families, and so gradually the population dwindled. So the 14 child family, or the 23 child family somewhere near our territory, was honored because they had 23 children. This reduced, and eventually Australia got worried because until the early 60s, Australia wanted to be a white Australia country. It didn't want yellow people from the north and others to be there. And so that changed in about 1964. But it's come back again to haunt Australia because immigrants coming in are very numerous, and Australia is now sending them off to Norfolk Island. Because the Australians have limited resources, and so there's a big argument about having immigrants in and providing resources for them. Australia tends to be a little on the social welfare side, so services are provided through a tax base, and that means that if an immigrant comes in, then they provided services, and that's costly to the institution. So it's not necessarily raging, but a very strong movement in Australia, which is anti-immigrant, not anti-legitimate immigrant, but it's the boat people who come in of their own accord, and so that's part of the development of Australia. It's fairly, I think the population of Australia has usually been about the same as the population of Illinois. Getting back to the hinterlands, my father was a pastor, and he had not been able to go to a high school because the family with 14 children didn't have the money to do that. He actually enrolled in a high school but had to retreat from it because the family couldn't afford him to do that. But he did study with the Congregational Church, and the dean involved was Dean Thatcher, and he was a MA from Oxford, and fairly liberal. The Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Congregationalists often intersect with each other, so they have a uniting church, which means that you don't have to have a proliferation of churches here, there, and everywhere. Like most countries, the church population is not as vigorous as it used to be. Churches used to be the center of community activity. They were the teachers, if there were limited school opportunities. They had gymnasiums. They were the centers of the community before schools proliferated. My father grew up with that, became a minister mainly because he was interested in moral code, and his preaching was that way. After about 5 years in charge of a Congregational church, he decided to quit because he felt that he didn't have the godliness that was expected by his congregation. So he went school teaching, and he had, prior to being a minister, he had been a carpenter and worked with glass and had all sorts of trades. He was coming into school teaching late in life. In Australia, the state controls your location, where you're sent. And since Father was a recent school teacher, he was sent to the boondocks. That's not unusual. As you gain seniority, then you get nearer and nearer cities and hubs of welfare where you could have your children visit and things like that. So Father went to Gulf Creek, which is on that slopes. He was sent to a village that had been a copper mining village, and the copper mine had fizzed out. So this was a group of people who were not very wealthy in an area that was large sheep and cattle stations. So by this time, my father had married my mother, who was a part of the congregation at the church, and so they settled down in Gulf Creek with a one-teacher school, one-room school, and perhaps 8 different grades if you had some children. There were usually with these small schools in the country, there were horse paddocks. So the children would ride their horses to school. That gradually dropped off as cars came in. But where my father was, there was only one car. And so eventually my father bought a 1928 Whippet and used that for a large part of his life. It was, I think it might have been 30 miles to the nearest towns. And it was in an area of soils that are rather slippery. And you had to be careful if it rained, you didn't get to do too much moving. Going to a store was not a possibility. What happened mostly was you had visiting salespeople. If it were for clothing, for fabric, for kitchen utensils, or mending a saucepan, or you had traveling salespeople. I can remember Uncle Bert, this happy entertainer. He would sell you things, but he would also entertain you. And so one of those salesmen coming up from the coast with oranges and fruit and vegetables would go to these small communities. One of those people was a vendor who knew that on the coast, just below this escarpment, was a village where the school teacher had resigned or moved to another place, and he was interested in having Ernie to come and be the school teacher there. Well, eventually, after about 5 years at Gulf Creek, Ernie became the school teacher at Thora. Used to be Never Never, but changed to the name of Thora. And because it was felt that Never Never was kind of outlandish. So we grew up quite happily with no electricity, no running water. You got your water off the roof of the house, and if you ran out of water in your 1,000-gallon tank, you went down to the local river, which ran along in front of this escarpment and then out into the ocean. And it was quite pure water. You brought it home, and if you wanted to drink it, you probably boiled it. But it was a place where there was low bridges. Low bridges allow flotsam and jetsam in a flooded river to go over the bridge. if you have a bridge that's just the right height for a flood, then it can be washed away. So these days there is a high-rise bridge that goes across the Brillinger River. But in our day, when we had to pull in water, we'd put kerosene tin, cleaned up kerosene tin cans on a running board. Cars in those days had a running board. And we'd take the back seat out and put water and cans in the back seat. So we'd dip the water out of the river from the bridge that was a low bridge going over the river. So this is sort of where we got to work with dairying people and on poor ground. And we had a small farm associated with us there. As with Gulf Creek, the horse paddock was fairly available because people were not using it as much as they used to. So we had several cows, and that's when we got into the discussion about milk and cream and butter. We probably had about 200 chickens. We didn't have any hogs, but other people did have hogs. And so that sort of pattern was on the coast where it is arable enough to do interesting things. When you got into the hinterlands, that was not the case. That's where Flynn got involved with small hospitals. We did have a hospital, a Brillinger River Hospital, with 2 doctors in our town and probably about 2,000 people. The lumber from those heavy-duty companies that were taking out the tropical rainforest, that lumber would come down the escarpment and go to small harbors where ships were being built for coastal trade. So my brother, who has been a shire engineer, sort of like a county engineer, and he grew up on the slopes, so he's there with fat lambs, pastures, some agriculture like oats and barley and wheat and corn and the regular corn and soybean thing. But it's also a place where you can have sheep for wool, sheep for meat. The breeds are slightly different. The mutton sheep is larger usually, and bred for mutton. The wool industry used a merino sheep which generated from Spain, and so the sheep come in various qualities of wool, and wool is judged by the crimps per inch, and a good merino superfine fleece would have many crimps per inch, which makes for a very good sweater or rug or whatever. The meat sheep, when more coarse, and so whereas you might have, I think I can remember right, about 200 crimps per inch for a super quality merino sheep. For a Lincoln, you might have 12 crimps to the inch. So 2 different styles of sheep, and the fat lamb trade allowed the lambs to to develop for about 2 years, and so we have qualities of mutton. We have fat lambs and hogget, which is probably over 2 years old, and mutton, and then older sheep are regarded as crackers and not so good for eating. As you get further west, you're mainly having flocks that are merino and merino cross sheep that are mainly for wool. In recent days, those slopes have begun to take on wine, vineyards, and one of the things that they've been doing is encouraging mohair, which is a type of goat that has a very fine wool. And my brother's town and my sister-in-law's town and their children, they grew up with a mohair stud. And it's interesting that Australia, on the slopes, often has genetic increase. So if you have a ram and a ewe that are well bred and the wool class as well, and they have lambs that are really very productive lambs, then they're what is called progeny tested. So genetic people will breed those sheep, and every once in a while have a sale. This small group of sheep usually has names. They have all the qualifications stressed out, and so I ran across a book which was Cudell Mohair Stud, and it was for a sale where these sheep would be sold to other breeders that would breed the sheep as a flying flock, and often they would be the second-level genetic suppliers, and they would have their own sales, and you dwindle down to the regular station owner that would have sheep or mohair animals, and so that sort of slopes area with a sufficient rain, a little bit of snow occasionally, were kind of arable. There was also mining in those areas. I stumbled across a little booklet on the bush ranges of Canowindra. Canowindra is on the slopes, and Canowindra has a river, Belubula River, that runs through it and drains off into the Gulf of Australia eventually. And these little towns grew up with the bullock tracks that were there to start with. So if you run down the main street of some of these little places like Canowindra, the main street is not straight. There's usually a hotel because you had to have a place to stay. You would use horses. But the bush rangers were often knowledgeable that there was gold and that gold was going to be shipped to places like Sydney, and they would invade. But they were also kind of cheeky. They were often sought by police and military, but these were teams of young people, often in their 20s, early 20s. And there was one gang near where my brother and sister-in-law lived, and they were 5 of them. And Ben Hall was the leader. Ben Hall is rather famous as a challenger of the system, and they would come to town and go to the local hotel and find the local talent and somehow channel people into the dance hall and dance with the ladies and steal the horses and disappear. And this is symptomatic of those slopes where there was both agriculture and mining. And it also had to do with handling some floods. So on the coast where we were, you'd have 80 inches of rain and a 2,000-foot mountain that you looked out as you woke up on the veranda in the morning. We would sleep on the verandas for coolness. Very humid, a little bit like the weather we've been having lately here. But as you go over the escarpment, over the plateau and down onto the slopes, you get less rain, 40 inches and less, and out to the desert where you'd be lucky to have rain in 5 years. But when you get it, you get a lot, and the ephemeral native plants would grow quickly because they would quickly lose contact with water. So in that arable slopes, you would have mining and agriculture, and the bushrangers would take advantage of that. Sometimes they came from substantial families. They were intelligent. They tweaked the nose of the military, the police, and the governments that controlled them. Often the forces were not given liberty to make decisions of themselves locally. They had to wait from dispensation from on high, and that didn't exactly work. So the bushrangers could move in, and often they received the support of local people because they too were somewhat critical of government control. There's a lot of independence in some of this activity, not peculiar to Australia. It's locally here as well. In the 80s, starting in 1830s, 1840s, 50s, getting a little bit more organized, and then gradually, by the First World War, things were getting a little more organized. And still, even in war, when Australians were moved to Gallipoli and were involved in World War I, it was often hand-to-hand fighting rather than having equipment. And that also went to World War II. I used to work for a company that did up leftover American vehicles, and that was there because Australians were prepared to go up to the islands and pull out vehicles that had been left there and take them. There was a huge field of Army vehicles, and every week we'd bring in one or two and restore them. So things changed some, and as you move through the century, starting about 1900, you started to get tractors and equipment that would replace horses. So, the horses went, and the dairying industry changed a little too. Even if you were 300 miles away from the city of Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, you could transport milk in sometimes refrigerated cars, and so the technology changed for the butter factories. The butter factories were supplying butter for the old country, England, and they had to have a fairly high salt content in their butter, mainly because there's a process called exosmosis, where if you put heavy osmotic solution around the outside of a bacterium or a fungi, it extracts the water, and that stops the growth of that particular colony. And in early days, it would take 6 weeks for a windjammer to get to England, so you had to keep that butterfat healthy in an era of no refrigeration. Gradually that changed. When my mother's family came to Australia, they were in a boat that was steam powered, and it may have to stop at the Cape of Good Hope to regenerate coal or whatever it was that was creating the steam, but they would be somewhat mechanized too.
Whole minute.
So,
we're almost done.
So
you're really close.
Okay. I wanted to say, I please would like to have some help to pick seed. We have New Jersey tea out there falling off because we haven't had the opportunity to pick it. It's fairly urgent, so I would like to have some volunteers to do that. And we're also moving the last piece of the Pocket Prairie to the 2nd Street dig. We're not quite sure what day that will happen, but keep in mind that we need some volunteer help. The phone number is 217-840-1911. Let me repeat it, 840-1911. If you could call in, that would be very helpful. We have to introduce you to New Jersey tea, which is a plant of note that we harvest at this time, but there are other prairie plants that we have on a railroad bed that is an abandoned railroad bed with prairie growing where farmers or others were not allowed to encroach upon the railroad line. So we have some original soil and some original species.
And we're done.
I think that's enough. This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and no one else.